The desert was quiet that morning, too quiet for a land that usually woke with the cry of hawks and the rustle of wind through dry mesquite. The sun had not yet climbed over the distant mesas, and the sand still held the faint cool of night. A pale mist hung over the land like a secret waiting to be told. And somewhere in that stillness, a woman's voice broke the silence. Soft, hurried, and trembling with both fear and determination. She was moving fast, her boots sinking in the loose earth, her breath short in the thin air. The woman's skirt was torn, and her hands were scraped raw, but she didn't stop. Cradled against her chest was a boy, barely 14, his dark hair tangled and his skin pale beneath streaks of blood. His eyes fluttered open now and then, only to close again in pain. She didn't know his name then, only that he was Apache, and that he would die if she didn't reach shelter soon. Behind her, the trail told a story of chaos, broken branches, a fallen horse, and a set of hoofprints not her own. The night before had been a blur. A group of men from the nearby settlement had gone after a band of Apache riders accused of stealing cattle. She hadn't meant to get caught in it. She was just passing through, heading west with what little she owned. But when gunfire echoed through the canyon, and she saw one of the young braves fall from his horse, something in her couldn't turn away. She remembered how he had looked lying there, motionless in the dust, the others riding off without a glance back. Maybe they thought he was dead, maybe they were running for their own lives. But she had seen the faint rise and fall of his chest, and known that he wasn't gone yet. Against every warning, every bit of reason, she had climbed down from her horse and gone to him. Now, miles from where the fighting had been, she reached the edge of an old hunting cabin, half broken, hidden by a cluster of mesquite. She kicked the door open and laid the boy on a rough wooden table. Her fingers trembled as she tore strips from her underskirt to bandage his wounds. The bullet had grazed his shoulder and left a deep gash along his side. She did what she could with the little water she had and whispered to him, as though words could fight death itself. "Hold on," she said, voice cracking. "You're safe now. Just hold on." He didn't answer, but she thought she saw his lips move, a whisper in a language she couldn't understand. She worked until her hands were slick with his blood and her own tears blurred her sight. When the bleeding finally slowed, exhaustion hit her like a wave. She sank to the floor beside him, her back against the wall, and listened to the sound of his breathing, faint but steady. The night stretched long. Coyotes howled in the distance, and the wind scraped against the cabin walls. She barely slept, haunted by what she'd done. Helping an Apache boy was dangerous enough. But saving the son of a chief, she didn't know that yet, was something that could cost her more than her life. By dawn, the boy stirred. His eyes opened, dark and sharp, despite the weakness in him. For a moment, fear flashed between them, his of being captured, hers of being mistaken for an enemy. But something unspoken passed, a quiet understanding that she meant no harm. When he tried to speak, she shook her head gently and handed him water. "You're hurt," she murmured. "Don't talk, just rest." He obeyed, though she could see the mistrust in his gaze. He was young, but there was strength in the way he carried himself, even lying there half dead. She could tell he'd been raised to be proud, to be unbroken even in pain. For 3 days, she tended to him in that lonely cabin. She cooked what little food she had, gathered water from a small creek nearby, and made sure no one saw the faint glow of her fire at night. Slowly, color returned to his face. The wound began to close, and he sat up by the second morning, though every movement still hurt. He didn't speak much, but when he did, his words were careful, his English rough but clear. "Why did you help me?" he asked one evening, his voice low. She looked at him for a long time before answering. "Because I couldn't just ride away." He studied her face as if trying to see past her words. Then, without a reply, he looked toward the door. She could feel the distance between them, not just in language or blood, but in the long, bitter history between their worlds. By the 3rd day, he said he had to leave. The tribe would be looking for him, he explained, his tone calm but certain. He said his father was a chief and that his people would think him dead if he didn't return soon. She wanted to tell him to wait one more day, to regain his strength, but she saw the fire in his eyes and knew he wouldn't stay. So, she helped him onto his horse, tied a small pouch of food to his saddle, and wished him safe travel. Before leaving, he turned to her. "You will not be forgotten," he said quietly. Those words stayed with her. When he disappeared into the red dust of the desert, she stood there long after he was gone, a strange unease rising in her chest. She had done the right thing, she knew that, but the desert has a way of twisting even the purest intentions into something else. Out there, mercy could look like betrayal, and saving a life could start a war. 2 days passed without trouble. She cleaned the cabin, packed her few belongings, and prepared to continue west. The land seemed calm again, as though nothing had happened. But early on the morning of the third day, she saw them. At first it was just a shadow moving along the ridge, then another, and another. Riders. The glint of metal caught the sunlight, and her heart went cold. They came in silence, their horses sure and swift. Within minutes, the cabin was surrounded. She stepped outside slowly, hands raised to show she carried no weapon. The air was heavy with dust and tension. Around her, a dozen Apache warriors sat on their horses, faces painted, eyes hard and unreadable. And in front of them rode a man older than the rest, his hair streaked with gray, his expression carved with sorrow and strength. The chief. The boy she had saved stood beside him, mounted but still pale, his arm in a sling. He said something in his language, and the chief dismounted, his gaze fixed on her. She felt the weight of it, not anger exactly, but something far deeper. When he spoke, his voice was calm yet filled with authority. "You saved my son." She nodded, barely able to breathe. "You crossed a line that others would not cross," he continued. "Now you must face what that means." She tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. The chief lifted his hand, and the warriors tightened their circle around her. The young man's eyes met hers briefly, not with hostility, but with something she couldn't name. Gratitude, perhaps, mixed with regret. The wind picked up, swirling sand between them. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled across the mesas. The land itself seemed to be holding its breath. In that moment, she understood that saving him hadn't ended anything. It had only begun something larger, something she couldn't yet see. She didn't know if they meant to thank her or judge her. All she knew was that she was alone, surrounded by a people whose laws she didn't understand and whose trust she had not yet earned. The chief's voice broke the silence once more. "You will come with us," he said simply. And before she could answer, the warriors closed in, their horses moving as one, the desert swallowing her and the cabin behind her. The sun burned high above, and the world seemed to vanish into heat and dust as she rode toward the unknown. Toward a fate that had begun the moment she chose to save a dying boy. The desert had given her a choice. Now, it was time to face the price. The ride through the desert was long and silent. The woman's wrists were tied loosely with a strip of leather. It's more a warning than a restraint, but enough to remind her she was not free. The Apache riders flanked her on both sides, their faces hidden behind shadows and dust. She could hear the steady rhythm of hooves striking the hard earth, the creak of leather, and the whisper of wind. No one spoke, not the young man she had saved, not the chief, and certainly not her. Every mile they rode carried her farther from the world she knew, deeper into one she didn't understand. As the sun climbed higher, the heat became sharp and unforgiving. Her throat burned, but she didn't ask for water. She had learned enough from the quiet strength of these riders to know that silence was safer than words. When they finally stopped at a shallow stream, she was allowed to drink. The water was cool and clear, a mercy she hadn't expected. She glanced at the young Apache near her, the boy she'd saved, and caught him watching her. His expression was hard to read, torn between pride and something like guilt. He spoke a few words to the older warriors, and they nodded, loosening her bindings. She rubbed her wrists quietly, unsure if it was an act of kindness or simply a practical choice. When they mounted again, the boy stayed close by her side. "You should not fear," he said quietly in broken English. "My father will decide." "Decide what?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Whether you belong among us," he said simply, then looked away. The words struck her like cold wind. She wanted to ask what that meant, but his tone made her stop. Instead, she stared ahead at the wide horizon, where the land shimmered under the midday sun. By late afternoon, the landscape began to change. The red earth gave way to rocky slopes, dotted with tall pines and hidden canyons. She could see traces of smoke in the distance curling into the sky, a village. The riders slowed their pace, forming a straight line as they approached. Her stomach tightened. She had no idea what awaited her, only that it would not be simple gratitude. The village was nestled between cliffs, half hidden from the open desert. There were small dwellings made of wood and hide, children playing near a corral, women grinding corn by a fire. But as the riders entered, everything stopped. Dozens of eyes turned toward her, curious, cautious, some filled with open distrust. A few men stepped forward, speaking quickly in their native tongue. The chief dismounted first, his presence commanding silence, said something to the people, his voice calm but steady. The crowd listened, their expressions changing with each word. Th. Boy dismounted too, touching his father's arm, speaking quietly. The old chief listened without interrupting. Then he turned to the woman and motioned for her to follow. They led her toward a large tent made of animal hides and poles, decorated with painted symbols that told stories she couldn't read. Inside, it was dim and cool. The smell of sage hung in the air. She stood near the entrance as the chief took his seat across from her, his eyes never leaving her face. "You helped my son," he said slowly, his English heavy but clear. "You brought him back from death." She nodded, unsure if she should speak. "You did what others would not do," he continued, "and for that I honor you. But the world beyond this land does not honor us. You know this?" She lowered her eyes. "I know," she said softly, "but I didn't do it for honor." "Then why?" he asked, leaning slightly forward. She hesitated. "Because he was a boy," she said at last. "He was hurt. I couldn't let him die there." The chief studied her for a long time. Silence between them grew thick, heavy with unspoken things. Finally he said, "Our people have seen much death. Many of your kind brought it to us, but you did not. You chose differently." He motioned to one of the older women standing nearby, who stepped forward and handed her a wooden cup filled with something warm and bitter. She drank, though her hands shook slightly. Then the chief spoke again. "You will stay among us until I decide your place. The desert saw what you did. It will tell me what must be done." She wanted to ask how long that would be, but his tone told her there would be no answer tonight. Two young women led her out of the tent and toward a small shelter at the edge of the camp. Inside was a woven mat, a blanket of fur, and a clay bowl filled with water. It was more kindness than she expected. That night, she lay awake listening to the sounds of the camp, the faint laughter of children, crackle of fire, the low hum of songs carried by the wind. It was a world so different from her own, yet she couldn't help but feel a strange pull toward it. But not everyone shared the chief's restraint. The next morning, when she stepped outside, a group of younger warriors stood nearby, watching her. Their eyes held suspicion, and their hands rested too easily on their knives. She felt the weight of their judgment with every step she took. One of them muttered something under his breath, and though she didn't know the words, the tone was sharp enough to make her pause. The boy she had saved, his name she learned was Koa, appeared then. He spoke quickly to the group, his voice steady but edged with warning. They backed off, though not without lingering stares. When they were gone, he turned to her. "They do not trust easily," he said. "You must be careful." She nodded. "I don't mean any harm." "I know," he said quietly. "But they remember everything. They remember what was taken from them." She didn't ask what he meant. The look in his eyes said enough. Days passed. She began to learn their rhythms, how the women ground corn at dawn, how the hunters prepared before setting out, how the elders gathered by the fire at night to tell stories. She helped where she could, fetching water, tending fires, mending simple things. The children followed her at first out of curiosity, then laughter. Their small kindness gave her a bit of peace in the uneasy days. Still, the tension never truly faded. At times, she caught glimpses of the chief watching her from across the camp, his expression unreadable. Other times, she saw Koa speaking quietly with him, their words too low to hear. Something was being decided. She could feel it. One evening, as the sun fell behind the cliffs, the chief called the tribe together. The fire burned high, throwing long shadows across the circle of faces. O's. She was brought forward, standing beside Koa. The air was heavy with expectation. The chief began to speak in his language, his tone measured but powerful. Though she couldn't understand the words, she could sense their meaning, a story of what had happened, of what she had done. When he finished, a murmur rippled through the crowd. Some nodded in respect. Others shook their heads in disagreement. Koa stepped forward and spoke briefly, his voice calm but filled with conviction. Whatever he said quieted many of them, though not all. Finally, the chief raised his hand for silence, turned to her. "You saved one life," he said, "but the desert does not forget the lives lost. Before I decide, you will come with us to a place where we listen to what the spirits say. Then we will know what must be done." She wanted to ask where they were going, but his tone left no space for questions. The crowd began to disperse, some glancing back at her with curiosity, others with lingering doubt. Koa stayed by her side until the fire burned low. "Do not fear," he said quietly. "My father listens to truth, not anger." She nodded, though fear already sat deep in her chest. That night she couldn't sleep. She sat outside her shelter, staring at the stars scattered over the desert sky. The wind carried faint voices, songs from the camp, whispers of stories older than any she'd known. She thought of the life she'd left behind, the quiet towns, the trails, the way people always talked about the Apache as if they were shadows. Now she knew they were people, proud, fierce, and bound by rules she was only beginning to grasp. When dawn broke, the tribe was ready to move. Horses were saddled, bundles packed, weapons strapped tight. She mounted the same horse she had ridden in on, her heart steady but uncertain. Koa rode ahead beside his father. The others formed a circle around her once more. They rode east, toward the rising sun. The land grew wilder with every mile, canyons deep as wounds, cliffs shaped by time and storm. The chief said little, but she could feel the weight of his decision forming like thunder in the distance. Whatever awaited her at the end of this journey, it would decide not only her fate, but the fragile bond between two worlds that had never trusted one another. And as they disappeared into the red glow of morning, she couldn't shake the feeling that the desert was watching, waiting for its say in what would come next. The trail wound through narrow canyons and dry creek beds. The kind of land where every sound carried far and every shadow could be hiding something. The riders moved quietly, their horses sure-footed on the rocky ground. The woman stayed near the center of the group, feeling the weight of 100 unknowns pressing on her shoulders. She still didn't know where they were going, or what the chief meant by listening to the spirits, but she could tell this journey mattered deeply to them. Every face around her was solemn, their silence heavy with meaning. Koa rode ahead beside his father, speaking little but glancing back from time to time, as though making sure she was still there. She tried not to meet his eyes, unsure what he wanted her to see. Part of her wanted to trust him, after all. He was alive because of her, but she also sensed a distance between them now. He belonged to this place, this world of traditions and secrets. She did not. By the second day, they reached a plateau that looked out over the desert, stretching endlessly below. The tribe made camp at the base of a tall red cliff, where the wind carved strange shapes into the stone. The chief told them they would rest here before traveling farther into the sacred lands. The woman didn't ask where that was, though curiosity burned inside her. She sensed it wasn't a place outsiders were meant to see. As night fell, the fires burned low and soft chanting began. It wasn't like anything she'd ever heard, a deep rhythmic hum that seemed to rise from the earth itself. The sound sent chills down her spine. She sat apart, watching the faces lit by the firelight. The people moved as one, their voices weaving through the darkness like a prayer. She noticed an older woman sitting nearby, her long gray hair braided with feathers. The woman had been kind to her since the beginning, offering food and showing her how to use simple herbs for burns and wounds. "They call this place the Red Mother," she said. "The land remembers. The chief comes here when he must ask for answers." The woman listened, her eyes on the fire. "Answers about me?" she asked quietly. "Maybe," the elder said. "Maybe about what comes next for all of us." There was something in the way she said it, a heaviness that hinted the chief's decision carried more than one consequence. The next morning, the chief gathered a small group, including Koa and the woman. They rode farther into the cliffs, following a path marked by ancient carvings. The air was cooler there, and the scent of sage and pine filled the wind. After a long climb, they reached a narrow valley surrounded by tall rocks where strange markings covered the stone walls. The chief dismounted, motioning for the others to do the same. "This place," he said, "is where our fathers spoke to the earth, where truth does not hide." He turned to her. "You will wait here until the night, and we will ask what the desert saw." She didn't understand, but his tone left no room for questions. The group spread out, setting up a small camp. Koa brought her water and a small bundle of dried meat. "Is this some kind of trial?" she asked him quietly. He looked at her for a moment and said, "It is a way of knowing. Spirits will speak through signs, through the wind, through what happens here. And if they don't, then my father will decide." His words didn't comfort her. She could feel a strange tension in the air, a sense that the land itself was holding its breath. As the day stretched on, she wandered near the edge of the valley, tracing the carvings on the rock with her fingertips. They looked ancient. Men, animals, storms, fire. What a figure stood apart, a woman holding out her hand to a fallen man. The image unsettled her. It looked almost like her and Koa on that night in the desert. She stepped back, heart quickening. It felt like the stone was telling a story that had been waiting long before she ever arrived. When the sun dipped low, the tribe gathered in a circle around the fire. The chief spoke in his native tongue, his voice deep and sure. Then the drums began, slow at first, then faster, echoing off the canyon walls. Sparks rose into the darkening sky. The woman felt her pulse match the rhythm of the drums. The chief placed a hand on Koa's shoulder. "You were between life and death," he said, half in English for her to hear. "She brought you back. But when one life is saved, another path changes, and we must see if that path brings peace or trouble." Koa nodded, his face serious. The firelight flickered across his scarred arm, the wound that had nearly taken him. The ceremony went on into the night. The chants grew louder, blending with the sound of the wind moving through the cliffs. She sat near the fire, feeling caught between worlds, part of her terrified, part of her drawn to the raw, pulsing energy of the moment. The chief threw a handful of powder into the flames, and blue smoke rose in swirling patterns. He looked up into the sky, then down at her. "What?" "The spirits will answer," he said quietly. When the wind shifted, the fire suddenly dimmed, the smoke curling into strange shapes. The chief and the others watched closely, murmuring to one another. The woman couldn't tell what they saw, but something in their expressions changed. Some faces showed awe. Others looked uneasy. Then one of the younger warriors, the same who had glared at her in the village, stood abruptly. He pointed at her. "She brings danger," he said harshly in English. "The white men come when one of theirs is lost. She will lead them here." The words cut through the night like a blade. The camp went silent. All eyes turned toward her. She shook her head. "No," she said quickly. "I didn't come to bring anyone here. I was only passing through." But the warrior's gaze stayed hard. "They always come," he said, "when they think we have one of their own." The chief raised a hand to silence him, but the unease had already spread. Whispers moved through the circle. Koa stepped between her and the others. "She saved me," he said firmly. "She could have left me to die. It did not." The younger warrior spat into the dust. "And now she will bring her people here. You think they will thank us for keeping her alive?" The chief's voice was calm but sharp. "Enough." The fire cracked, and the smoke rose higher. The wind howled through the valley, carrying dust and the faint cry of an eagle overhead. The chief watched the sky for a long moment, then turned to her again. "Tomorrow," he said, "we will see if the desert sends a sign. If there is danger, we will know." That night, sleep did not come easily. She sat awake by the dying fire, the flames shrinking to red embers. Koa came quietly and sat beside her. "They are afraid," he said softly, "not of you, but of what might follow you." She looked at him. "Do you think they're right?" He hesitated before answering. "The world beyond this land has never been kind to us. When something changes here, it rarely ends in peace." She thought of the men from the settlement, the ones who had fired first in the canyon. Maybe they were still looking for her. Maybe they'd already found the broken tracks leading toward the cliffs. The idea chilled her. "What if they come?" she asked quietly. He looked into the fire. "Then my father will protect our people, and you will have to decide who you stand with." His words stayed with her long after he left. She stared up at the stars until the first light of dawn touched the cliffs. The world felt fragile then, balanced on the edge of something she couldn't yet see. When morning came, the tribe prepared to move again. The chief said they would travel deeper into the sacred lands, to a place where the earth spoke in ways only the brave could hear. She rode in silence, the heat of the day rising around them. By midday, they reached a narrow canyon cut through red stone, where the air shimmered with heat. The riders stopped. The chief dismounted and walked ahead alone, kneeling to touch the ground. When he arose, his face was grave. He turned to the group. "There are fresh tracks," he said. "Many horses, but not ours." A murmur rippled through the warriors. The chief looked toward the horizon, then at her. Koa's expression darkened. "They followed," he said quietly. The woman's heart sank. She knew without being told who they were. Men from the settlement, riders who'd gone after the Apache before. They must have found the trail. The chief gave quick orders. The warriors scattered to prepare, their movements calm but sharp. Koa turned to her. "Stay close," he said. "If they come, it will not be talk they bring." She felt her pulse quicken. The desert stretched silent around them, but in that silence, danger was already moving. The wind picked up again, carrying dust across the open ground. Somewhere far off, she thought she heard the faint echo of hoofbeats. And for the first time since she'd stepped into this land, she realized the choice she made to save one life might soon decide the fate of many. The air turned heavy as the wind shifted. The sound of hooves was no longer distant. It came closer, echoing through the canyon walls like a warning. The woman froze where she stood, the leather reins slipping from her hands. Around her, the Apache warriors moved quickly, their calm replaced by quiet urgency. Arrows were checked, rifles loaded, and horses repositioned behind rocks and scrub. The chief gave low commands, his face unreadable, but his movement steady. Koa rode up beside her, his horse restless under him. "You must stay behind the rocks," he said, his voice tight but controlled. "Do not move until I tell you," she tried to speak. But he had already turned away, joining the others gathering near the canyon mouth. Her chest ached with fear, not only for herself but for all of them. She knew what was coming. The men who followed had no mercy left in them. To them, every Apache was the enemy, every shadow a threat. The sound of the riders grew louder until the first figures appeared through the heat shimmer, dust-covered men on horses, rifles glinting in the sunlight. There were at least a dozen of them, maybe more, and at their front was a man with a wide-brimmed hat and a scar across his cheek. He looked around the canyon with sharp, calculating eyes. "Spread out," he shouted. "They're here somewhere." The woman's heart sank. She recognized him. He had been one of the men in the canyon during the raid, the one who had fired first. She remembered his voice, his anger. If he found her now among the Apache, there would be no reasoning with him. The chief stood tall beside the fire-scorched rocks, his rifle lowered but his presence commanding. When he stepped into view, the riders froze for a moment, startled to see him so calmly waiting. The scarred man narrowed his eyes. "You've been hiding one of ours?" he called out. "Hand her over and we'll leave in peace." His words cut through the silence, twisting the air between them. The chief did not reply immediately. He looked toward the woman, then back at the riders. His face remained calm, but his grip on the rifle tightened. "She came here because the desert brought her," the chief said finally. "She is under my protection." The scarred man let out a hard laugh. "Protection? That woman belongs to us? You can't just take what isn't yours." Koa moved to stand beside his father, his jaw set. "She saved my life," he said. "You left me to die." She did not. The man's expression twisted. "You should have stayed dead, boy. Would have saved us all this trouble." A murmur spread among the Apache warriors. Bows were drawn tighter, rifles raised an inch higher. The chief's voice stayed level, but there was warning in it. "No more blood needs to be spilled," he said. "Leave this land while you can," the man smirked. "You think I take orders from you?" He turned to his men. "Search the canyon." At that command, everything shifted. The Apache warriors moved as one, positioning themselves in the rocks above, their arrows ready. The desert went still again, the kind of silence that comes before a storm. The woman crouched behind a boulder, her heart pounding in her ears. Then a single shot cracked through the air. It came from the ridge no one saw who fired first, but once the echo faded, chaos took over. Rifles boomed, arrows flew, and dust exploded into the air as horses screamed and reared. The woman pressed herself against the stone, trying to stay small as bullets chipped the rock beside her. Koa's voice rose above the noise, shouting commands in his language. The chief moved calmly through the fray, his rifle firing with precision, never wasting a shot. The riders from the settlement were skilled, but they were fighting in the Apache's land now. The desert itself seemed to turn against them. Still, the battle was brutal. Sound of gunfire rolled through the canyon like thunder. She could see Koa darting between the rocks, his movements quick and sharp despite his still healing arm. Then she saw one of the riders take aim at him from behind a boulder. Without thinking, she scrambled from her hiding place, grabbing a fallen rifle. Her hands shook as she lifted it, the metal hot against her skin. She fired. The recoil slammed into her shoulder, and the man dropped from his horse. The sound stunned her, the violence of it, the sudden finality. For a moment the world felt unreal, but there was no time to think. Koa turned, his eyes meeting hers from across the chaos, a mix of surprise and something like pride flashing in his gaze. The fight dragged on, dust and gunpowder thickening the air. The scarred man's voice could still be heard, shouting orders, furious now. Find her. Don't let her stay with them. His words cut through the noise, and she realized with a chill that he wasn't just trying to escape, he was trying to take her back, to prove a point. To him, she was evidence, a reason to strike harder. When the smoke began to clear, she saw him breaking through the line, riding hard toward her. His horse charged through the dust, eyes wild. She tried to move, but the ground was uneven, her legs weak from fear. Koa saw it first. He shouted something to his father and spurred his horse forward. The two men met in the middle of the canyon, the young Apache slamming into the rider with such force that both fell to the ground. The scarred man rolled, drawing his pistol, but Koa was faster. The struggle was fierce, both of them locked in a fight that felt older than either of them, two worlds clashing under the burning desert sun. The woman could hardly breathe. She wanted to help, to do something. But the chief appeared beside her, pulling her back behind cover. His grip was firm but not unkind. "Stay," he said. She could see the storm in his eyes. Not just anger, but something deeper. The heavy knowledge that this fight was about more than one life or one tribe. It was about survival, about a history written in blood and dust. The clash between Koa and the scarred man drew every eye. The others stopped firing for a brief moment, both sides watching as if the desert itself demanded it. Koa managed to wrench the pistol away, throwing it into the sand, but the man grabbed a knife from his belt and lunged. The blade flashed, catching the sunlight, and for a second, everything slowed. The woman screamed his name without thinking. Koa dodged, the knife grazing his side, but he caught the man's arm and forced it downward. They struggled, their feet kicking up dust, each movement desperate and raw. Then, with a sudden burst of strength, Koa twisted the man's wrist until the knife dropped. The chief stepped forward, his rifle aimed, but before he could fire, the man shouted, "You think this ends here? You'll pay for taking what's ours?" His words echoed through the canyon, filled with bitterness and fear. Then he grabbed a fistful of sand and threw it into Koa's eyes, breaking free. He stumbled toward his horse, but before he could mount, the chief fired once. The sound cracked through the air, and the man fell. Silence followed, thick and unbearable. The echoes of gunfire faded into the cliffs. Dust settled slowly, coating everything in a dull red haze. The remaining riders turned their horses, fear flashing across their faces. Without another word, they retreated, their figures shrinking against the wide horizon until they were swallowed by the desert. The Apache warriors stood still for a long moment, waiting to be sure it was over. Then, one by one, they lowered their weapons. The chief let out a deep breath, his face carved with both relief and sorrow. Koa wiped the blood from his side and turned to the woman. His expression was unreadable, part anger, part gratitude. She wanted to speak, to explain, but her voice wouldn't come. The chief looked at her then, his gaze steady and unreadable. "Now you see," he said quietly, "the desert remembers everything. It brings life, but it also brings judgment." She felt the truth of his words like a weight pressing against her chest. The desert had given her a chance to do something good, but it had also tied her fate to theirs in ways she hadn't expected. As the tribe began to gather their things, the chief ordered the others to move camp before nightfall. "They will come again," he said. "Not today, but soon." The land will not rest. Koa helped her mount her horse, his movements careful. The wound on his side bled lightly, but he ignored it. When their eyes met, neither spoke. There was no need. Both of them understood that what had begun as an act of mercy had become something far larger, something that could not be undone. As the sun began to set, the sky burned orange and red. The tribe rode toward the cliffs, the wind carrying the scent of smoke and gunpowder. Behind them, the canyon lay quiet once more, holding the memory of what had happened like a scar carved into stone. And though the fighting had stopped for now, the woman could feel it. The storm was not over. Something darker was still coming. The desert was watching, waiting for its final say. The following morning, the desert was quiet again. The dust had settled, and the faint smell of smoke lingered in the air. The tribe had moved deeper into the canyon, far from the place where the battle had ended. The woman woke to the sound of the wind brushing against the canvas of her tent. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. Then the memories came back, the gunfire, the shouts, the moment Koa had fallen, and the silence that followed. She sat up slowly, her body aching from exhaustion, and stepped outside. The camp was already awake. The Apache women were tending to the wounded, and the men worked quietly, repairing arrows and saddles. No one spoke much. The fight had left a mark on everyone. It wasn't just the loss of men or blood spilled, it was something deeper, the understanding that peace could never be taken for granted. The chief stood near the fire, speaking softly with his son. Koa's side was bandaged, and though his face was pale, his eyes were clear. When he saw her, he nodded once, a small gesture that carried more than words. She walked toward them, unsure of what to say. The chief noticed her and gave a slight nod. His voice was calm, though tired. "You have seen what this land does to men," he said. "Test the heart. It shows who stands for life and who destroys it." He looked at her for a long moment, then added, "You did not run. You fought beside us. For that you have our respect." She wanted to thank him, but her throat felt tight. All she managed was a quiet, "I didn't want anyone else to die." Koa looked at her then, his gaze steady. "You saved me," he said. "That cannot be forgotten." They stood in silence for a moment, the fire crackling between them. The woman knew she couldn't stay forever. The men from the settlement might return, or soldiers might come if word spread. She didn't belong to this land, not the way they did. Yet she also knew she wasn't the same person who had stumbled into the desert days ago. As the sun rose higher, the tribe began to pack their things. The chief had decided to move toward the northern hills, where water still ran through the rocks and the ground was cooler. The woman offered to help, but the chief shook his head. "You must go back," he said. "Your people will look for you." She hesitated. "They won't understand." He studied her with calm eyes. "Then teach them," he said. "Tell them what you saw. Tell them that we are not ghosts or shadows. Tell them the desert belongs to no one. It only remembers." Koa stepped closer. "The trail east will take you home," he said. "It's long, but you'll make it if you leave before noon." Her heart sank a little at his words. "And what about you?" "I'll be here," he said quietly. "The land is our home. Doesn't let go easily." They looked at each other for a long moment, both knowing this might be the last time they would meet. There was something in his eyes, a quiet strength, but also sadness. He reached into the small leather pouch tied to his belt and pulled out a beaded necklace. It was simple, made of bone and turquoise. "Take this," he said. "It will remind you that you are part of our story." She accepted it with shaking hands. "Thank you," she whispered. He smiled faintly. "No," he said. "Thank you for not turning away when you could have." By midday, she had a horse ready and a small pack of water and food. The chief and his people stood quietly as she mounted. The wind had picked up again, carrying with it the sound of the desert, the soft rustle of dry grass, the distant cry of a hawk. Before leaving, she looked back one last time. The tribe was already moving, their horses and mules winding through the rocks, their silhouettes fading into the red and gold of the land. The journey back was long and lonely. The desert stretched endlessly before her, beautiful but harsh. At night, she would stop by small fires and stare up at the stars, the same ones that had guided the Apache for generations. She thought about what the chief had said, that the desert remembers. She began to understand it in her own way. Every rock, every gust of wind, carried the memory of what had happened, not just between men, but between worlds. When she finally reached the edge of the settlement, days later, her heart felt heavier than when she had left. The small town was quiet, its streets dusty, the people wary as she rode in. Some recognized her and stared. To them, she looked changed, thinner, sunburned, her eyes older. She dismounted and walked toward the sheriff's office, where a few men were gathered, their voices low. The sheriff looked up in disbelief. "We thought you were dead," he said. "I almost was," she replied. "Where have you been?" "Where have you been?" "In the desert," she said. "With the Apache?" The room went silent. One man muttered something under his breath, but the sheriff raised a hand to quiet him. "You'd better tell me everything," he said. And she did. She told them about the storm, about the tribe that had found her, about the men who had followed and what their hate had caused. She spoke of Koa, of his courage, and the chief's wisdom. She didn't spare the parts that made the settlers uncomfortable. When she finished, the room was silent again, but this time, it wasn't disbelief. It was something else. Shame. Reflection. The sheriff finally nodded. "You did right," he said, "but it won't change how some folks think." "I know," she said softly, "but maybe it's a start." Over the following weeks, she stayed in the town, helping where she could. When travelers asked about the Apache, she spoke truthfully, without anger, but with clarity. Some listened, others didn't, but she kept telling the story. It became her way of honoring the people who had saved her, of keeping their memory alive. The necklace Koa had given her never left her neck. Whenever she felt lost, she would touch it and remember the warmth of the fire. The songs sung in a language older than time, the faces of those who had treated her as one of their own. One morning, months later, she rode out again to the canyon. The desert looked the same, yet she could feel the difference. The wind was softer, the silence deeper. She dismounted near the rocks where she had once hidden and stood still for a long time. The sand had covered most of the traces of that terrible day, but she could still feel the memory there. She spoke quietly to the wind. "I kept my promise," she said. "They know who you are now." The breeze shifted slightly, warm against her face, and for a moment she thought she heard faint laughter, the echo of a song, a whisper of life that refused to fade. She smiled through her tears. The desert wasn't empty. It was alive, full of voices and stories that stretched beyond time. As the sun dipped low, she turned her horse back toward the town. Behind her, the canyon glowed red and gold, like a fire that would never die. She didn't look back this time. She didn't need to. The desert would always be with her, just as she would always carry the people who had changed her heart. And though the world around her would go on, divided and uncertain, she had found something lasting in the middle of all the pain, a kind of truth that could not be taken away. That even in the harshest lands, kindness can bloom. That courage is not about fighting for power, but for life. And that sometimes the place you think will break you ends up showing you who you truly are. The wind rose again as night began to fall, carrying the scent of sage and sand. It brushed past her like a farewell. She smiled faintly, whispering into the fading light. "The desert remembers." Then she rode on, the horizon stretching ahead, endless and free.